Thanks, you guys, for sort of honoring me with this invitation and letting me sort of chat with you a little bit about this particular matter. So as Stefan noted, and I guess as he emailed everybody, the subject is this paper that I recently put out called "Open Labor Market Operations." The title is meant to be to resonate with a familiar term of art in financial and monetary circles. Essentially, the allusion is to open market operations as conducted by the New York Fed trading desk. This particular practice that the New York Fed is engaged in, or that the Federal Reserve System as a whole is engaged in for many decades, is widely accepted, widely thought to be an important part of the monetary policy toolkit. The basic idea is that every morning the New York Fed buys and sells Treasury securities essentially in order to modulate the money supply. It has a sort of an ongoing kind of contractual arrangement with a number of so-called dealer banks. And what it does is, when the thought is that the money supply ought to be sort of fine-tuned upward to accommodate more transaction activity or more demand at a given time, then the New York Fed will buy U.S. Treasury securities from the dealer banks, replacing those securities then with just plain old money in those banks' reserve accounts. The theory being that as their reserve accounts grow, those banks will lend out more and hence put more credit money into the system. And then when the thought is that the economy is overheating, or that there's an excess in the money supply, in light of a given day's requirements, it'll simply do the reverse of that. It'll simply sell treasuries and thereby taking money out of banks' reserve accounts and replacing those monies again with treasuries. So the idea is to sort of modulate the money supply in a very kind of fine-tuned or fine-grained sort of way on a day-to-day basis. And you can sort of think of this, I suppose, as the most sort of advanced sort of the state of the art when it comes to kind of fine-tuning the money supply on a daily basis. Those decisions, by the way, are made on the basis of all sorts of analysis, of all sorts of reams and reams and reams of data that are collected the day before, that are run through computers. And so the idea is, over time, the Fed develops some facility in sort of figuring out, what the next day's demands are likely to be, and hence what the trading strategy ought to be, in order, again, to kind of keep that money supply sort of properly modulated. And by properly modulated, I just mean that they want the currency's value in terms of goods and services that it can command or purchase to remain more or less stable over time. Now, that is, again, a sort of a familiar operation, seems to be widely accepted by economists, unless they're kind of fringe types who think we should go back to a gold standard or something. As one of Mr. Trump's most recent nominees to the Fed apparently thinks that we should do. So the gimmick of the paper, in a sense, is to sort of note, for the sake of the economists at least who accept that practice, that the best way to understand or interpret that practice, the best way to sort of understand the justification that we all recognize for the central banks doing this, is a justification, basically yields a justification that would carry over to other markets as well, right? So the best interpretation, I think, of what justifies a Fed intervention in the markets in order to control the money supply is that we have decided as a society that interest rates are, in a sense, what we might think of as a systemically significant price. And here I'm sort of drawing an analogy, implicitly at least, to the idea of a systemically important financial institution of the kind that falls under a special regulatory regime after the Dodd-Frank Act was enacted in 2010. So the thought would be that there are some prices that are systemically important, either because they enter into many, many other prices, right? That they end up being, that they're sort of components of other prices, or because they are associated with some sort of index, which is then used widely as a benchmark in the pricing of other things. And that's, I guess you could think of that as another avenue by which one price can enter into other prices. So the thought would be then that some prices, we've decided as a society, are so important in view of the fact that they enter into the formation of many, many other prices, that we're entirely comfortable with our central bank intervening in the markets in order essentially to impose a kind of collar, a kind of a relatively narrow band within which that systemically important price is permitted to fluctuate. Now, the reason that I am sort of tempted to kind of argue from that angle for a job guarantee, or again, some kind of price fixing when it comes to wages or salaries, is that that's a mode of argument that even orthodox economists who are normally, sort of efficiency obsessed, tend to recognize, even when they don't recognize justice arguments. And what I'm sort of keen to do is to enable, basically to get a wide agreement on essentially a social imposition of a band within which prevailing wages or salaries would be kept, right? Wouldn't be permitted to sort of drop below, at least. So we want to we would want a floor at the very least under prevailing wages and salaries. Now, as I think I argue fairly early on in the paper, there's a justice argument, I think, for maintaining a floor underneath wages and salaries. And there's an efficiency argument sounding, again, in price stability for doing that. And from my point of view, the justice argument is always the most important argument. It's the one that trumps all the others. Or if it doesn't trump all the others, it at least ought to be weighted more heavily than the others. Even if you don't have a sort of lexicographical ordering of values, at the very least, you would weight the justice concern here much more heavily than anything else. But what I'm trying to do with the paper is to sort of reach another audience of, in particular, again, even orthodox economists who might not typically be moved by justice arguments, even though they should be. And so if you can make an argument sounding in efficiency via its sounding in price stability, then presumably you can get more sign-on from an even broader constituency for actual public intervention, quote unquote intervention in markets in order to maintain that kind of a floor. So that's the basic idea behind the paper. At least that's what the paper is meant to do. Is it's meant to sort of encourage economists to note that there are other systemically important prices additional to the money rental rate, i.e. the interest rate, and that the kinds of arguments that justify interventions with respect to the one systemically important price carry over to other systemically important prices. And then the hope would be that they would, again, join the rest of us who are more justice prompted in agreeing that there ought to be some sort of a minimum floor that's maintained. Now, the next thing I suppose worth noting is that to some extent we already agree, even many economists agree, that there ought to be some kind of a floor. That would be essentially any economist who approves of or agrees with the idea of a minimum wage, right? But the thing that I think is superior about an open market operations way of dealing with this particularly important price, the thing that makes it a better idea, I think, than minimum wage laws, actually there's several things that I think render it preferable. One is that there's much greater flexibility, right? The minimum wage has to be legislatively changed, and that's a longer process. It takes much longer, and we tend to go for many, many, many years, between adjustments to the minimum wage. And so you have a kind of a stair step, a kind of a jagged pattern. If you look at the rate of wage increases over time, as those increases are prompted by or brought about by changes to minimum wage laws, you could, in theory, have a much smoother sort of regular adjustment and much more frequent adjustment of those wages if you were actually to adopt a kind of open labor market operations sort of regime, because you would essentially be running it very similarly to the way in which you run the current open market operations regime. A second reason I think that it might very well be preferable is that in theory, you could impose minimum standards in respect of more than just wages or salaries, right? You could, in effect, impose a minimum conditions on other working conditions, right? That basically various other various other, I suppose you could say, um, components of working conditions or workplace conditions, including hours worked, whether there's overtime, how much notice you have to be given before you're suddenly phoned up and brought in to do something, to work on a day that you weren't thinking you were going to work. Basically, all of the standards that we might think of as going into a full characterization of what a humane or just workplace would be, a workplace that's sort of whose conditions are consistent with human dignity. All of these could, in effect, be baked in to a particular open labor market operations regime. And so, in that sense, then the OLMO regime would be a kind of, I mean, you could sort of think of it, at least, as a kind of sort of, again, just sort of setting a basic floor that's sort of adjustable over time. And you could think of it then as constituting a kind of public option. And it would do the same kinds of things that so-called public options are generally touted for or celebrated for, right? You say, basically, if privately offered conditions fall significantly short of the publicly offered option along any dimension or any number of dimensions, then there's always an alternative available to individuals to go to, which then effectively forces the hand of the private sector to meet those same sorts of minimal conditions. So that's the basic idea. I ultimately, just to sort of put my own, my cards on the table more broadly, I mean, I ultimately think that a better society would be one in which wage labor just is not the way we do labor at all. I tend to think, and in this, I think Alan Thomas and I are in very broad agreement, that there really ought to be a much more equitable distribution of productive capital across society, so that nobody actually has to work at a wage, for anybody else. But until we get there, I think a sort of reasonable second best, a kind of quasi self-employment regime, you might say. Let's say that a society in which everybody has a roughly equitable share in productive material capital is one that would be a sort of a self-employment society, right? A society in which nobody works unless they, wish to work, or nobody works other than in voluntarily assumed cooperative arrangements with others in the kind of labor co-op sense. If that's the ideal, if that's the sort of gold standard, let's say, and we call that a self-employment society, then we might think of a society that offers a job guarantee or an employee of last resort function or program, or an open labor market operations regime. And these are three, I think, roughly synonymous ways of naming the same kind of program. We could think of this as a reasonably close second best, depending on how many sort of conditions we build in. Because at least if we had a democratic polity where we really are democratically choosing our government officials, and if the program then is itself subject to democratic decision, then you could think of this as a kind of indirect self-employment, via the medium of the state. And that, it seems to me, would be far better than what we have now. What we have now, I think, is almost entirely unjustifiable. I actually do think that there will come a time in the not too distant future that we'll look back on the present time and with astonishment and with a certain degree of indignation or a sense of shame even, that we actually once had a society in which it was possible for somebody to be, ready and, wanting to be able to earn a living, wanting to work in order to earn a living, and simply couldn't do it because of, enclosure, where 3% of the population owns all of the productive assets or what have you, right? That just should never be possible, it seems to me. And in that sense, I think that the old knights of labor, who were the more left-leaning contributors to the labor movement in the 19th century until they were all, kind of killed off, I think that they weren't altogether wrong when they described the wage system as a kind of labor rental system that was sort of not that different in kind from a labor purchase system, which slavery was, right? That basically, buying somebody rather than renting somebody is sure a bit worse, but renting people isn't so great either, and that's why they actually referred to that system as the system of wage slavery, and they viewed the mission of the labor movement as a mission to stamp out that kind of an arrangement. And I think there's a lot of moral truth in that outlook, in that way of looking at things. And so, again, ultimately, I'd like to see us get to a point where we are indeed a sort of a self-employment society. But I think a plausible step along the way to that would be something like that I'm sort of projecting in the paper. And again, the way the paper is written is meant sort of to kind of appeal to a certain constituency that might not have been moved by the sheer justice arguments, but might be moved by, again, an argument that sounds in efficiency in the form of price stability. So I guess that's sort of the summary rendition. What do you think, Stefan? Is that a good point at which to sort of stop and open up discussion?
Well, it's a shame that we had to do this apart from the seminar where we were all together, but I'm still very glad that we're doing it. For the benefit of Robert, what happened was that Alan in particular finally convinced me that the employer of last resort provision in Minsky was actually as important as many people make out, and I had been in error not to see it. So this has been revelatory rather than confirmatory. So I mean, look, I'm a fully paid up member of the club on this one, except for one thing, and even then it's a hesitation rather than a categorical. So I like to describe myself as MMT adjacent, right? In the sense that the question you always get with this stuff from everyone as well: how are you going to pay for it? And the simple answer is MMT. And on the other hand, and on the one hand, with interest rates basically on a 700-year linear decline, the world's awash with money, massive inequality, no inflation, and practically no capacity to generate inflation, and you have the imperial currency. Why the hell not? Right? So I mean, I technically know you can do this. So as a description of mechanics and plumbing, the how do you pay for it question is a non-question, but it's all politics. I mean, a good example of this was 2 days ago, the 2-year budget agreement that got signed. So all of the hand-wringing about austerity and Bowles and Simpson and how we don't have any money anymore, whatever, the minute it becomes politically expedient, it's disappeared. It's gone, right? So the thing that I worry about with this stuff is the politics of the whole thing. How do you win the political argument? Now, part of that's the moral argument, but there seems to be at least a third of the country that don't give a shit about morality as we conventionally construe it, or in fact like causing pain to other humans. I would put it that way. And then there's the very, very powerful backers of the current order who like having basically labor on command as a commodified resource, etc. So even though I agree with all of this, how do I get it to happen? What's your answer to that? How do you think about the politics of this?
Yeah, so I guess a couple of things. So the first thing is that, yeah, like you, I'm MMT adjacent, although the more I hear from the more partisan adherents these days, the farther I feel from adjacency. It seems that they're getting a bit, I don't know, a little bit more chip on the shouldery now that people like Krugman and others are, appear to them to be taking their ideas. And so they're actually sounding more and more hysterical to me. And I used to call myself a fellow traveler, and now I'm thinking of myself more as a kind of a loose ally, right? And so that's, I guess, the first point. On the politics, part of the point of the paper, I guess, is it seems to me that it might be possible. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me say one more thing about the MMTers while I'm at it. I've never been really quite clear on what they're on about when they say that the job guarantee is itself an automatic stabilizer to the macroeconomy. It seems to me that they're right on half of that. It seems to me that they're right from below, but they're not right from above on that. And so I think that Alan is right that Minsky cared a lot about the ELR and that the ELR was a big part of his vision. But I also am sort of at pains to say that I think he's a little bit less than clear on the sense in which this is an automatic stabilizer. Now, that being said, this takes me to sort of what the strategy of the paper is. It does seem to me that there are some people who are not moved by justice arguments. I'm always first moved by a justice argument, and to me that trumps everything else, right? But it seems to me that there's probably a significant number of people who are not that moved by justice arguments, but are moved by so-called efficiency arguments, and that a price stability argument can be offered as a form of efficiency argument. And so if you can make the case for the proposition that prevailing wage or salary rates are what I'm calling a systemically significant price in the way that the money rental rate is, then it seems to me it might be possible to get some people to sign on who might not otherwise sign on, where you say, look, this is simply a matter of macroeconomic stabilization via maintaining, right, a certain floor beneath which wages or salaries won't drop. And that itself is important as a way of maintaining, sufficient aggregate demand in the macroeconomy as to keep things kind of humming along, right? So that's basically that's what I'm sort of hanging my hat on. Now, it might be that even that's not enough, right? There might, to convince sufficiently many people. There might be, in other words, enough, sort of well-meaning but not that justice-oriented or that stability-oriented orthodox economists who would still say, well, I don't care, it's still a goofy idea. How can we afford it? Or how would we ever do that? Or it seems silly to think that everybody ought to be viewed as having a right to a job or whatever. And those folk, of course, aren't going to be convinced by an argument like this, but it's the gambit, I suppose, of the piece is that there might be a significant slice of the economically informed electorate who might be convinced to sign on by that style of argument, even when they're not the best argument. Is that responsive?
Yeah, I mean, so I'll put on my pointy-headed economist outfit for a minute and say, okay, but let's say I'm morally sympathetic to this. Then the two questions that I have to be able to convince my undergraduates, who I've taught about the perils of intervention and the wonders of efficiency, are still number one, how you're going to pay for it. Now, here's the particular form of how you're going to pay for it. Let's say that this is more than just a minimum wage claim or minimum wage floor. Let's say that you really push this up to, let's say, $18 an hour, right? Let's call it $20, keep it simple. So when you do that, you utterly destroy low-wage sectors. And given the way that jobs have been developing in the private economy, that's about backhanded about 50% of all jobs that have been created in the past 10 years are below $20. Now, on the one hand, you could say, Yahoo, and we're going to get all those people better jobs. And there's lots of work to be done, whether it's green proofing and all the rest of it we could be doing. But putting aside all of the politics of how do you get there and we all agree on what the jobs to do are, et cetera, right? There is this kind of giant sucking sound as all of those economic sectors either automate and collapse, thus reducing employment. And a greater burden than ever then goes on the government, who are presumably not producing jobs that make profits. Therefore, the ability to recycle profits back into paying wages means that there's a deficit out there that has to be filled somewhere. So how do I convince my undergraduates that's not a problem? Yeah.
So I guess, I mean, I don't know for certain, but I mean, it seems to me there are two avenues to look at, and then whether this works or not, I suppose, would be subject to empirical check, right? But one avenue that I suppose one would explore would be the multiplier avenue, just to see, all right, well, how much aggregate demand or how much effective demand are we actually adding to the economy, and what's the growth effect of that, and then what's the fiscal consequence? It's at least possible, right? There's some possible worlds, I suppose. Whether they're plausible worlds is another question, but there are at least possible worlds, right, in which the multiplier is significant enough that you actually do generate enough growth to make the whole thing sort of self-liquidating, as it were. I guess the other avenue would be to think about other means of dealing with the expected inflationary impact in the event that the deficit itself began to kind of balloon or explode, right? Because I take it that the real concern that people have when they express the deficit concern is that it ultimately, pans out into some sort of inflation or hyperinflation. And if that's the case, or at least insofar as that's the case, then the other avenue to explore, I guess, would be what other means do we have of tamping down inflation? Now, the MMTers, among their many, I think, flaws or weaknesses, is they have a tendency to think that there's simply one tool, right, to deal with the inflationary impact in the event that inflation emerges, and that's, of course, just raise taxes, right? And
because, of course, it's very easy for Democratic politicians to raise taxes.
Oh, they do it all the time.
Whatsoever.
Yeah, every 5 minutes, right? But the trouble, in my view, at least with the MMTers, is I don't think that they're sufficiently attentive to other institutional features, you might say, of our economy that offer additional means of tamping down on inflationary pressure. So, I mean, one way of thinking of macroprudential financial regulation, at least this is the way I always cast it, is as itself a kind of an inflation mechanism, inflation fighting mechanism, or what I call a kind of a credit money modulatory mechanism. Mm-hmm. So basically, you can simply change leverage requirements or capital requirements, as we call them in bank speak, in cases like this. Another possibility that I've floated in the context is something I'm calling a people's portfolio. And the idea here would be that the Fed would maintain a gigantic index fund, in effect, that would basically replicate the market as a whole. And then if it looks as though prices are rising in some sort of unsustainable or in some sort of credit-driven way in some subsector of the market as a whole, short those particular
take short positions on the index, right?
Yeah, and then go long in an area where things are falling too low, which you can sort of view QE3 as having done with respect to mortgage instruments, right?
Right.
And so various strategies of that sort might do the trick, but again, these are just possibilities, yeah. And how effective they might be would I assume be an empirical question. Yeah.
So one result of the technical glitch is I've lost control as host. One of you may have control as host. The workaround will be, I'll just go down the list as people join and just ask if you have any questions. And you might go to request from your perspective to turn on your video or your audio if it's not on, whoever you might be. And hopefully whoever is the host can say yes to that. But let's see what happens. At the very least, you should be able to talk. And we should be able to hear your audio. There's only one person whose audio is turned off. So the next person on the queue would be Alan Thomas. Alan, do you have any questions?
My question is whether Mark as host can turn my video on.
Let's see.
I can see the crown has moved over to Mark.
Oh, Mark has the host.
I don't know where it's going. Yeah, there you are.
There you are.
I am supreme.
You are supreme. Somehow you've wrested control of this operation. I can hear the camera too. I actually know you have the camera.
Perhaps, Stefan, we were forced to elect a leader. And Mark stepped up very kindly. So Robert, terrific paper. Obviously, I loved it.
Thanks so much, Alan. Thanks.
We have, as you know, very similar positions. Do you think it's fair to say that from like a Minskian perspective, the full employment, putting the floor under employment has to go alongside a general reconception of the macroeconomy, and I wouldn't even call it enhanced regulation of the financial sector, really trying to exert a lot more constitutive authority over the way that sector operates. So, yeah, I hear what you say. With everything else, ceteris paribus, just introducing the floor underemployment could have various perverse consequences. But it is part of an overall package. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And if we went with the whole package, then perhaps we wouldn't have to worry so much about the consequences. I mean, obviously, I'm doing this from the justice perspective. So if you say to me, there's only one way, as it were, transcendentally to prevent the labor market being alienating, well, then we're going to have to do it, right?
Yeah, I'm with you on that, actually. That's where I am. Yeah.
And what struck me as really interesting was the difference between your position and David Ellerman's position. So,
Mm-hmm.
you know, David thinks, well, yes, we all have to basically be self-employed or the labour market will be alienating.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, we have to be employed in workplace democracies
Mm-hmm.
because only that preserves the ideal of universal self-employment.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas you're doing things kind of constitutionally, and obviously I find that very appealing, where if there is, as it were, the constitutional specification of the requirements of justice, and as in rules that requires full employment and the state as employer of last resort, now our hands are untied at the level of micro-institutional forms.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
We don't have to say, however desirable they are,
Mm-hmm.
the only kind of organizational form in the economy should be a worker-owned democracy.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, a workplace democracy.
Mm-hmm.
Would you care to comment on the difference between the way you're doing it and the way David does it?
Yeah, sure. So I think as a matter of sort of ideal theory, ideal normative theory, I'm largely with David. I think before you came in, I talked a little bit about the Knights of Labor and, you know, the sort of the road not taken in the American labor movement, at least. That was, you know, a truly competing road up until about 1918 or so. You know, once they started killing Wobblies and, you know, the Knights of Labor were all sort of shunted off as well. I tend to think of that as a, you know, sort of an ideal to which to approximate or to try to approximate. But what the way I view the proposal is as a kind of reasonable second best on the way there, at least insofar as the political institutions that we have are indeed democratic, because then you can sort of think of us as being kind of quasi self-employed. If we do indeed democratically determine, you know, the personnel who administer our state, and if we democratically determine what the particular rules or what the particular norms that are followed by and within our state are, if all of that is truly democratically determined, then there is at least a kind of a sense in which we're kind of indirectly self-employed that doesn't seem to me to be just a joke or just a, you know, a bad joke. And it's then we almost have to think in terms of, I suppose, of subsidiarity, that like the ideal situation would be one in which everybody is fully self-employed. Then one step removed from that might be one where we form cooperatives with others and we're sort of jointly employed, but none of us is actually literally self-employed. And then we sort of imagine groups that grow larger and larger and larger to the point where it just embraces the entirety of the state. And so there's still a kind of self-employment there, but it's a kind of first-person plural self-employment rather than a first-person singular self-employment. And that, you know, basically if you can kind of move from maximal first-person plural self-employment to, you know, closer and closer to the end state where you're sort of first-person singular self-employed, that would be great, and that's what we ought to be striving for. But nevertheless, even if we fall short of that, it seems to me that there's a kind of categorical difference between a situation where indeed you do have a democratic polity, and hence we are sort of first-person plural self-employed under a JG type or ELR type arrangement on the one hand, and an arrangement where we say, well, this should be left entirely to the existing distribution of property and whatever market outcomes proceed from that initial distribution that we just basically view as untouchable on the other hand. Is that sort of responsive, Alan? I mean, is that?
Yeah. I see the way you're doing it.
You see the kind of the thrust of the sort of the trajectory of the thinking there, even if it's maybe a little bit muddled.
So if we could, I think Bill Edmondson and then Stephanie Mudge. Bill, do you have any questions?
Yeah, I have a question. I didn't get a chance to get all the way through the paper, Robert, so I apologize for that, but I didn't get to the justice part. But, I would have a hard time explaining the paper to someone else because I'm kind of stuck with the idea that, well, this has to work by some mechanism involving the government as employer of last resort. And at the same time, I'm hearing a theme of self-employment economy having the sort of attractive normative features that, say, a property owning democracy might have. And I'm thinking, well, what do I say when the person I'm trying to explain things to comes back to me and says, you're just talking about, government of last resort, a government job to keep wages, a floor under wages. How is that self-employment? Is the idea that I'm self-employed because I have a vote?
Yeah. Yeah, well, so that's where the attenuation comes in, right? So again, if one way to think about this, I think, and again, this might be a muddled way to think, but it seems to me, I'm initially attracted at least by the following picture. The ideal end state, I mean, pure self-employment would be one in which everybody has an equal pro rata share of the stock of capital that nobody's responsible for having brought into existence, right? So, think of this in terms of, I guess, what Hillel Stein calls the global fund, what Dworkin, I guess, would have called resources, what Jerry Cohen would have called access to advantage, what Dick Arneson calls opportunity for welfare. Whatever the sort of ethically exogenous stock of working material is, the ideal state, I suppose, would be one in which everybody has an equal pro rata share of that and then can employ him or herself, in effect, by working that material, so to speak. Then there are various degrees of departure from that ideal. And so the farther, the greater the degree of departure, the more of a stretch it sort of feels like to describe it as quasi self-employment, but at least there's a kind of thread there. So if you and I form a business partnership of two, and we kind of throw our working capital together and we form a two-person general partnership, now I'm no longer self-employed, but I'm us-employed, right? And then we can grow out the partnership to 5 to 10 to 100 people. And each of us now becomes a little bit less individually self-employed as the number grows. But again, there's still at least a certain kind of self-determination in here, insofar as we're all collaborating and cooperating and voting together. Now, if you carry that logic, to its ultimate extreme, and you actually have a democratic polity under some plausible conception of democracy, which of course is another can of worms, but if there's some broadly acceptable democracy, pursuant to which we can analogize the polity to a worker-owned co-op or a business partnership that's owned by its partners, then you have something like a kind of self-determination there, a kind of self-employment. But as I was saying before, it becomes first-person plural rather than first-person singular self-employment. And the degree of attenuation, I suppose, depends partly on the size, the number of people who belong to that first-person plural we, and then partly on the arrangements pursuant to which decisions are made, right? But that's, so, and if that's the story, right, then yeah, it's a little bit of a stretch to say that we're kind of self-employed under a JG in a democracy. But I think it makes a certain sense, and it certainly seems to make more sense than to say that, well, you're sort of self-employed when there is no JG or ELR, and when your government actually isn't plausibly characterized as democratic, and when furthermore, the elites who actually control the apparatus of the state are perfectly content with the maldistribution of material resources currently live under and are willing to sort of hypostatize that in the form of property law, right? I guess that's sort of where I'm coming from, and I don't know whether it's too much of a stretch, but it seems to me that there's at least something intelligible, some intelligible guiding thought in there.
Stephanie, do you have a question? Can you hear us now? And do you have a question, Stephanie?
Yes, I can hear you. So I guess I know that the whole question of, the democratic conditions of such a thing is a can of worms, but I think arguably it's prior, to this, especially if you look at how, I think one could argue right now that we have in the US and in lots of other sort of ostensibly democratized countries, a situation where people have formal democratic rights, but not meaningful ones, where they're, actually participating meaningfully in democratic decision-making, have candidates they actually want to elect, who have real sort of distinctive and potentially and meaningfully representative programs to offer. So I know this is a separate set of concerns, but it seems to me that to get to the degree of political sophistication, economic sophistication that you would need to make something like this plausible, you actually do need you need to think about democratic institutions and how democratic institutions are currently not functioning first. So I know it's a separate set of concerns, but I'm still interested in hearing your thoughts on, how we get there.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess one way of characterizing the paper is to say that I sort of bracket, but I bracket in a very self-serving and convenient sort of way. The question of what a properly or plausibly democratic polity would look like, or what would be the constraints, what would be the sort of sine qua non conditions that would have to be fulfilled in order actually to have a democracy. I'm sort of assuming, for the sake of the paper, that we have an answer to that, and that we've actually then acted on the answer and put in place a polity of that sort. If I take that question or set of questions out of the brackets, and then look at, say, current polities and ask, do any of them fulfill the requirements? My guess is very few, if any, do, for one thing. And for another thing, I think there's just no way in hell that one can say that the United States does, right? I don't think there's any plausible way to say that American conditions right now even remotely approximate to with a sort of constitutive features or sort of recognize or sort of the characteristic features of an actual functioning democracy would be. Given that, then, if I argue for something like what the paper sort of sets out as a policy that I would hope that we would put in place, that President Ocasio-Cortez will sort of push through a democratically run a Democrat-dominated Congress. And let's say we're still not a democracy when that happens, then I think I would have to say, well, at least these conditions are kind of like what they probably would have been if we had been a democracy, right? And so then I can say it's sort of a happy accident, maybe, that we live under those conditions, at least as far as workplace conditions are concerned, right? But again, then it would be sort of a happy accident. And I guess that's an important, I suppose that's a live question too, right? I mean, it sort of reminds me of the old, the causal theory of truth, right? Or the old, the idea of the broken clock being right twice a day. I mean, if we accidentally, is it intelligible to suggest that we could sort of accidentally sort of fall into a situation in which our polity maintains an ELR program that actually is exactly as it would be had we been a truly democratic polity, even though we're not? Does it count in that case? And I suppose if you're of that kind of causal theory of truth persuasion, you might want to say, well, not really, because there has to be some intelligible nexus between where you are and how you got there. And if you didn't get there via democratic decision-making, then the happy accident doesn't really count. And somebody else might say, well, no, it's just really the circumstances on the ground that matter. And I'm not really sure where I would come down on that one. But I do feel confident in saying that there's, if we did actually have something that we could agree as a democratic polity, and the polity were to adopt something along the lines proposed in the paper, that would be significant, that would bring us significantly closer to that ideal end state of universal self-employment than we are now. And then we would be likely to be able to be, absent a plan of that sort.
Okay.
So maybe we could ask some questions from over here. If you don't mind, I'll just ask a quick one and try to keep it brief.
Sure.
One pushes in favor of the proposal, one pushes against. The one that pushes against, perhaps, is this worry that that this could do harm, particularly because one big difference is that there's the possibility of sectional effects on the labor market. And so even the kind of things that we described as the kinds of jobs we give, it looks like there's real potential for, okay, it's yet more opportunities for well-educated and folks, our knowledge workers or that kind of thing. So one worry is like how to protect against this possibility of distorted or unfair or unjust sectional effects. The favorable comment would be the fact that this would be run through an agency might be an interesting opportunity for constitutional design within an agency, because it's a narrow set of issues about the structure of the labor market. And I take it that there's a lot of leeway within the agency to construct the democratic input however you might want to do that. And you could do it regionally across, different sectors, different parts geographically. You could do it across sectors. There's all kinds of ways you could do that. You could recreate a democracy with respect to the labor issues writ large.
Yeah, what a wonderful observation, Stefan. Let me start with the last one, just because it reminds me of something that I'm often at pains to sort of get across to my students at least when I'm in my sort of Pollyannish sort of mode. And that is that, it's often, in American legal thinking and legal discourse, one sort of strain of thought or discussion has to do with, so-called democratic deficit. And, to what extent does a democratic deficit come into play when you've got an administrative agency administering a program or some statutory mandate, but it's not, when that agency is not itself, sort of elected, or its personnel are not actually elected, but instead chosen by putatively elected people. And, one thing that's often overlooked by those who criticize administrative agencies on that ground is that those agencies themselves often engage in something that's very democratic when it comes to determining what sorts of rules to impose or what sorts of changes to make to rules that they've already got. So there's there's a sort of a legally required notice and comment period that has to be opened up in connection with any proposed rule change by an agency. And these agencies will often bring in, focus groups to sort of get people's thoughts as to, what changes to a particular regime or a particular rule might be favorable and what should be avoided. They'll also, of course, they're required by law to put out a so-called notice of proposed rulemaking, and then various people sort of comment officially. They send in letters, they post them online, and then the agencies kind of look over all that stuff. And I don't want to get too tedious about it, but basically there's a kind of, sort of something vaguely democratic about that. And indeed, there's something even more directly democratic about it in some cases, because you're getting feedback from directly affected persons, from who might be affected adversely or non-adversely, right? And you could imagine some similar arrangement in connection with whatever agency was administering an EOR program. And as you suggested as well, Stefan, it might very well be that you have distinct regional offices, sort of in the way that you have regional distinct Federal Reserve banks, in different regions, that would maybe be more attentive to, salient circumstances within the regions in which they were operating or over which they had jurisdiction or what have you. And so you might, by that means, maybe build in a certain degree of, democratic decision-making or democratic constraint that might not otherwise have been there. And it in some ways might be even more, directly democratic than electoral politics allow for, at least at the national level. So I very much like that suggestion. It seems like something that really we ought to make a point of doing in the event that we actually end up instituting anything.
We want something out of the box ready to go.
I'm sorry?
We want something on the shelf ready to go.
Yeah, shovel ready, right, yeah. Well, believe it or not, we're actually kind of working on that now as part of the Green New Deal effort. But I can bore you with more on that later. But we're actually, all of us who are part of the planning for the Green New Deal, we've got Mr. Obama's, notorious words from 2009 very much in mind, the old shovel ready point. We actually want everything to be on the shelf, ready to be taken down immediately once, President Sanders takes office in January of 2021. But I guess we'll see. The first one, your first observation was more from it was more fault finding.
The sectional effects, that there's like this could make things worse in terms of justice, because it could be just one more vehicle to promote certain interests. Just even the kinds of things that are on the table, it looks like it go to certain parts of the economy. And the floor here isn't a floor like in these other contexts. It's a floor that's different in different sections of the economy. It's not one price that we're setting.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I don't know that there's a general recommendation that can be made by way of safeguard against that prospect. I'm guessing that this is the kind of problem that would be sufficiently particular as to require, dealing with when it comes up, right? Because my guess would be that the answer to different manifestations of that general problem would be different, right, than it would be to other possible manifestations of it. As a general matter, I mean, I suppose one possibility would be you just say, well, look, any job in any sector is in theory available to anybody, but that's probably not a satisfactory answer, because presumably there are limits as to how many you actually need to get certain things done. If there's just not enough demand economy-wide for a particular commodity to be produced or a particular kind of service to be offered, maybe you can only employ, up to 10 people full time, because it's such a niche sort of category of wants that this particular activity is satisfying. But you just have to say, well, this particular job is only available to 10 people. And then it probably wouldn't do to say, well, anybody can do that. But I haven't thought about it enough to, I suppose, to have a satisfactory answer as to how, as to what sorts of general principles that one might lay down for sort of how to deal with each particular manifestation of that category of problem.
Thanks. Jorge?
Thank you. I don't know if you can hear me. Can you hear me?
Yes, I hear it quite well. Thanks.
Okay, great. I have a question. You're talking about subsidizing or regulating a market, the labor market. Let's imagine that you have a bunch of people working in the production of goods, not in the service area, not providing services, development of goods. You're subsidizing those goods. Now, here's my question. What happens with free trade agreements? Because that pushes you're regulating and subsidizing a set of products that are going to be competing with foreign products that you already have treaties about not subsidizing. So this just models the picture. I'm just thinking about this. And I think that in the long run, you would have to reject a lot of those free trade agreements for this kind of proposal to work. Now, I don't know if that would be feasible, or how can we push this when we have a set of globalized markets. Now, I would love for markets to be caged again, but I don't know if we can do it. So that would be my concern at this point.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, in general, I suppose where the angle from which I come when I think about global trade arrangements and global financial flow arrangements and the like is, it's broadly in sympathy with what I think was the view of a lot of the progressive economists of the interwar period, and then a smaller number of economists who were left over after the Second World War. But as I understood the ambitions of Keynes at Bretton Woods and sort of like-minded economists at that time and in the interwar years, the ideal was essentially to enable maximum flexibility for each individual polity to sort of determine its internal sort of economic arrangements. And then you would have free flows or unrestricted flows as consistent with that value of domestic policy autonomy. And I find that a compelling vision, at least until such time as we can actually have something that would pass for a global democratic polity. But I think that absent a global democratic polity, the thing to do, the ideal sort of global arrangement would be one that sort of maximizes the degree of sort of internal policy-making autonomy. And if that means the imposition of capital control, or if that means rather less ambitious free trade agreements than we've been putting into place, especially since the Uruguay round, then so be it. Again, from my point of view, that's the way I look at it. Because ultimately, it seems to me that the ultimate argument for the completely untrammeled sorts of trade agreements and the completely untrammeled financial flow guarantees is a view pursuant to which we view the global economy as one single integrated economy. And I just don't think a single integrated economy is a good idea unless you have a governmental authority that is of comparable scope, right? So if the maximum extent of regulatory jurisdiction is that of the nation state, then it seems to me that should also be the maximalist extent of a fully integrated economy. And that anything that falls short, you know, any arrangement, any grouping of people that falls short of one authority with maximal jurisdiction over the entirety of it is one that also is one in which the idea of a fully integrated economy is not a compelling ideal. You know, it might be worth striving for, all else being equal, but insofar as there are value conflicts, you know, between a completely integrated and open market of that sort on the one hand, and regulatory capacity over, again, an economy of that extent on the other, I think it's the integration that has to give. But,
Thanks. Fernando, did you have a question?
Yep. Thank you for your talk.
thanks. Hi.
So my question would be, I think this goes a little beyond the scope of your paper, but it's a natural follow-up tree, which would be if we're trying to put a floor under the jobs, we need to establish the conditions for the OM mellow for the jobs that will be seasonably hiring or expanding, contracting, and so on. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, we might just as well deliver even more power to these corporations that are creating the same problems that we're trying to solve with the market operations for labor. Mm-hmm. And my question would be whether you think that in these conditions, there's some space for universities and for the open source movement. Mm-hmm. And what I would like to say with that, giving a concrete example, is that in Spain, in the Basque countries, there's a corporation, which is the Mondragon Corporation. It's a collective of a bunch of smaller cooperatives, and they're the biggest corporation there, and the fourth largest in Spain, I think. They employ over 80,000 people in this cooperative system. So do you think that we should perhaps give more powers to universities and the open source, because this corporation was created alongside with educational institutions. Mm-hmm. In Cornell, for example, there's the Agua Clara initiative, which is a way to teach people how to produce clean water. Mm-hmm. And it's completely open source. Anyone can reproduce this in poor communities. So do you think this can be a good idea to include in a Green New Deal as to funnel funds to such sorts of initiatives instead of huge corporations that are already...
Yeah, no, I do. So there's sort of another line of work that I do. And this sort of gets me back to some of Mark's observations before. I mean, you know, one thing I think I do agree, actually, I won't even hedge it with I think. I mean, one thing one thing I think I do agree with the MMTers on, assuming that I have them correct, is that it really makes sense to use the apparatus of state to provide financing for things that we think are socially desirable, right? I mean, here's a way to look at this. You know, there was a kind of a famous or relatively well-known debate or argument between advocates of cooperatives or labor-owned firms on the one hand, and Paul Samuelson, of course, on the other hand. And Mark can correct me if I'm wrong. I think this debate occurred during the early 70s, maybe the late 60s. But Samuelson argued against the idea of the labor-owned firm or the cooperative on essentially along sort of Coasian lines, right? The claim was that, you know, look, even if you had labor hiring capital instead of capital hiring labor, you would end up with the same arrangements that we have now because capital is in short supply. So capital would be able to impose various conditions on making itself available. And so labor would basically end up submitting to these conditions. And lo and behold, they would end up, by and large, replicating the conditions that labor works under now. The fault in that claim, I think, of course, was that it traded on what I call in other work, the intermediated scarce private capital myth, right? This conception that there's this kind of shortage of finance capital out there. It's all owned by private parties, and these private parties have a right to own it. and sort of common sense about incentives plus the justice of property rights means that we should let the owners of that capital call the shots. And so if all of that were correct, then there might have been some purchase to Samuelson's argument. But the moment that you recognize that, well, no, that's not really true of money capital, that it's in some sort of inherently scarce supply in the sense that, it's just like a quantum of gold out there or something, and a bunch of private parties own it. Insofar as you deny that and say, well, actually, you can always, in effect, redistribute credit money simply by publicly spending it in one sphere and then pulling it out of some other sphere, which is a kind of backdoor confiscation. As soon as that's open to you, it becomes possible to say, all right, well, actually, labor-managed firms don't have to be viewed as facing this kind of very restricted supply of capital that they might be able to tap into and work with. And as soon as we make that move, it seems to me that it makes really good sense as a matter of public policy for the polity to make it possible to, basically to make financing available on reasonable terms to labor-managed firms, and that we ought to put a finger on the scale or a thumb on the scale in favor of those kinds of firms, at least insofar as doing so doesn't, cause more harm than it eliminates, right? I mean, I'm just assuming, ceteris paribus again. To make, I guess I'm sort of, meandering here a little bit, but I'm familiar with the Mondragon phenomenon. I'm a great fan of it and a believer in it. And I actually think you could have a lot more Mondragonism in Northern Europe. I mean, it's interesting, co-ops do rather well in a lot of Southern Europe. I mean, Spain, obviously, but also Italy, some other sort of Southern Europe. Northern Europe, it seems to me, could do a lot better about encouraging the spread of labor-owned or labor-managed firms, partly by making capital more readily available to such firms. And if you can only do that by also confiscating some of the capital that's currently held by, the 3% who apparently own half of it, I'm cool with that. I think there's no reason to sort of honor that particular distribution. So yeah, I mean, I think I'm in sympathy with your question, right? I think I don't want to be taken, in other words, to be sort of endorsing or aiming to sort of make life even easier for those who partake of a particular organizational form. The corporation as we have it in America today is a co-op too. It's a capital co-op instead of a labor co-op or some other kind of supplier co-op or producer co-op. And I just don't see any reason why. I mean, the reason that the capital co-op there's a microeconomic argument for why the capital co-op dominates, but I think the microeconomic argument for it tends to ignore certain institutional features of our financial system that are also playing an important role in giving the capital co-op a leg up. And one of them is precisely the fact that we allow private rentiers to dominate the allocation of capital. And if we were to eliminate the arrangements that make that possible, I think that the capital co-op would be a much less dominant form, and the labor co-op would correspondingly flourish. And I'm entirely in favor of trying to make that happen. And indeed, quite a bit of the other work that I do, and indeed even a book that I have coming out in the coming year, is precisely about that. So I think I'm with you on that.
Bill, I saw your hand go up. Did you want to jump in on that point?
Actually, I was applauding.
You were applauding. Okay, that's what it was.
This is American Sign Language applause.
Okay.
The DSA convention is going to be in Atlanta next week.
I'm waving the window.
I see Mark and I see Matt. Mark, did you want to jump in on this point, and then Matt?
Well, I would, but unfortunately I have to go do another American thing, which is called go pick up someone from camp.
Okay, yeah. And if they're like my kids, they hate being there, so you should hurry.
So if I still have control, I'm just going to leave this board up, and then you can all disappear at some point, and I'll come and switch it off tomorrow.
Okay.
Thanks so much, Mark.
Until then, au revoir.
So Matt and then Violetta?
I'll let Violetta go. I was just showing another form of
Oh, I see. All right.
snap.
Okay, I had a question because when you started your talk, you talked about justice concerns and how you had justice concerns, but you're going to make the arguments in terms of efficiency. Mm-hmm. And I guess not to say that your proposal is expected to create complete justice and deal with all inequality, but maybe I just have a question to you about how far you're anticipating it to go towards meeting these, dealing with inequalities and justice concerns and the kinds of things that it can't really deal with. And I'm thinking about other kinds of things like crime or health concerns or basic human rights, or specifically if we're thinking about floors under salaries, people who can't work, people who work from home, people who care for the elderly or their children, people who are not able-bodied. And so those kinds of justice kinds of concerns. So how does your proposal fit into some of these greater questions about justice and inequality?
Yeah, so I think, I might be wrong about this, but my initial thought is that it's kind of neutral with respect to sort of adjacent fields in which justice questions are salient, right? So if we take, for example, the case of somebody who's just not able to work for pay, at all, right? Maybe a person is significantly disabled, or maybe a person is sort of kind of indirectly or vicariously disabled because she has to, or he has to devote all time to caring for somebody who's in the family who's disabled in a realm where we, of course, don't want to marketize and hence don't want to have the person be at least paid by employers to do. I'm thinking that, it basically, the plan has kind of nothing to say about that, so that one would presumably be able to make whatever arguments one was antecedently inclined to make on behalf of whatever solution to that kind of problem one was inclined to offer or to favor, right? So if I think, for example, that solution A is the ideal solution to deal with the person who's not able to, earn a living owing to some, actual disability or vicarious disability, I don't think that what I'm pushing here would impinge upon, one way or the other, the question of whether A is indeed the best solution to that particular, or the best way to sort of address that particular challenge or problem. So in that sense, I think that what I'm proffering here is kind of speechless, right, about these adjacent justice implicating realms. That being said, I do think that there would be radial effects that would have a kind of justice significance. So, for example, there seems to be a very rich degree of documentation or of empirical support for a number of propositions that I think are connected to some of the examples that you brought up. So crime rates do seem to correlate pretty closely, right, to high unemployment or underpayment or what have you. Declining or poor health statistics also correlate. Early death, stress, and stress of the kind that then opens out into violence or crime or self-harm, or again, even just unhealth. All of that seems to correlate pretty closely to, and really kind of dramatically with both the degree to which available employment falls short of living wage employment, and with the degree of so-called precarity associated with the particular form of employment, right? The very uncertainty that that you'll have a job tomorrow or whatever. And so I think in that sense, insofar as those themselves are justice concerns, in addition to being, welfare concerns or however people want to sort of categorize them, it does have implications for all of that, right? It seems to me, bring about a better, end state along those dimensions of assessment as well. Now, it's possible, I guess the last point I'd make here is, I suppose it's possible that somebody with a really great sort of a really accurate synoptic understanding of how every one sphere of activity interacts with all others, somebody with a kind of a general equilibrium mind where, they can actually trace out, 10,000 unforeseen consequences of a particular plan, might be able to, sort of step in and say, oh, no, but you're ignoring, that basically 800,000 people are suddenly going to be dying really agonizing deaths as soon as you put a plan like this into place. They would, of course, have to sort of, show their work, so to speak, and sort of explain the steps, how they got there. But I mean, I guess I can't a priori rule out the possibility that there's some sort of unforeseen concatenation of consequences that would actually, on balance, make the whole thing look awful. But I have to say that I can't see what those would be. And so insofar as that's the case, it seems to me that it's not wildly implausible to say, well, all else being equal, this is good. And there's not a lot of reason I can see for all else not to be equal, at least with my present state of knowledge,
Daniel, did you have your hand up? Daniel Corin?
Yeah, I did. So just a question. I had a couple questions about the technical side of the implementation of your plan, but I just want to move to the bigger kind of conceptual question I had, because I think this kind of builds somewhat nicely on the question you just answered. So you mentioned all of this is predicated on the assumption that justice motivations are treated as separate in the body of lit here that I don't admittedly know well at all, so I'm sure this will betray that fact, but treated as separate and kind of inferior, not as important as, not as worth consideration, than efficiency arguments, efficiency motivations. So I'm wondering how neatly or rigidly that distinction is drawn and how it ought to be drawn.
Yeah.
So, for example, sorry, just a quick example. There might be a state of affairs in which some system is implemented which is in fact unjust, but is not known to be unjust, or at least the vast majority of the population don't justifiably believe that it's unjust.
Mm-hmm.
There is a very different state of affairs in which, of course, most people do know, or they do justifiably believe that it is unjust, and this in turn presumably would have some impacts on efficiency-related factors, how motivated people are to go out and get work, how motivated people are to contribute to an economy. Of course, I mean, I'm sure you know much more about this than I do, but I'm just assuming this would have some pretty non-trivial impacts on economic efficiency. So this is all just to say that one of the sort of your starting assumptions and something that came up in your response to the previous question seems to me questionable, namely that your topic and your argument and your suggested plan is silent or neutral with respect to areas in which justice is important. That the justice issue to me seems, once we take epistemic access seriously, the justice issue is important.
Yeah, so I mean, it might be I'm not fully understanding the question, but if I am understanding the question, then I think I have been unclear in getting across what motivates the proposal. So I myself think that the justice concern or the justice interest in any particular course of action or any programmatic movement is the most important concern, right? And I'm probably even inclined to, order values lexicographically and say that if it's not just, it's just not done. It's not going to be done. That no matter what kind of quote unquote efficiency argument you give me for something, if it's unjust, I'm simply not going to be moved. And indeed, I go so far when it comes to that putative clash between justice and efficiency as to be unwilling even to recognize as efficient anything that is demonstrably unjust. I actually don't think that there is an intelligible conception of efficiency that would be in competition with justice. And in my more sort of theoretical, egg-headed writing, I often distinguish between what I call, sort of popular conceptions of efficiency on the one hand, and what I call ethically cognizable forms of efficiency or understandings of efficiency on the other. And if somebody's conception of efficiency is not ethically cognizable, then to me it's not efficiency at all. It's just fetishism, right? It's just sort of Another way to put this would be to say that, you know, growing the GDP a bit larger, if done in an unjust way, it's just ethically uninteresting. There's no normative significance to it at all. It's just fetishism of growth for growth's sake, right? So that's where I am, and that's sort of where I come from in everything that I do and push. What I say about justice and efficiency in the paper is a sort of, it's something more in the realm of sort of argumentative strategy, you might say, rather than actual sort of first order value commitments. And what I mean by that is I think that there are some, this is essentially a practical or pragmatic argument. I think that there are some economists out there, and I'm probably actually overestimating economists by saying only some. I think there's some economists out there who think that they believe in a conception of efficiency that is not actually compatible with justice. And that insofar as they believe in it, they weight it more heavily than justice. They might even be indifferent to justice. And that group of economists, I think, are more likely to be convinced that we ought to do something if you can make an argument to them that effectively is saying that even by your own lights, right, even according to the particular evaluative standards that you yourself employ, this is a good idea. Right? So even if you're indifferent to justice, you should like this idea. That's sort of what I'm trying to do with the paper, right? That basically the ones who, there's a sizable number of economists who think that there's a conflict between justice and efficiency. And I think that's wrong, but they seem to think that. They then prioritize what their particular conception of efficiency, which is a vaguely sort of Calder-Hicksian form of efficiency. And then they'll view an argument in favor of price, they'll view price stability as one determinant of efficiency of that sort. That if you have price volatility, particularly if it's very dramatic, sort of high amplitude volatility, that itself is deeply inconsistent with efficiency of the sort that they value, right? This is basically the people who talk about all the wealth that's lost when there's a crash, for example, owing to sort of massive volatility. Those people, I think, are confused and muddled when it comes to the values that they're acting on and that they're choosing on the basis of. But if we take them as we find them and just for the moment, just sort of give up on the attempt to sort of convince them that they're wrong as far as their values are concerned, and just sort of say, okay, well, just to save time, I'm going to point out to you that even on the basis of the particular value that you do claim to adhere to, a good idea, then we get more people to sign on. So in that sense, it's not really a philosophical argument in the paper. It's just sort of an attempt to sort of reach a certain audience that might not otherwise have been reached. Is that responsive?
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you.
Great.
So that brings us past 3:30. Robert, do you have to go right now? Or
no, I'm fine. Yeah, I'm still flex.
So maybe we should say if anyone needs to go, feel free. None of us will think ill of you if you take off. But if anyone has, I think Nicole and Matt have not asked questions yet. If either of you guys have questions, you might volunteer. And then if anyone has a follow-up, like Stephanie, I just saw her hand go up. Nicole, Matt, would you like to chime in, or would you like to go ahead and pass?
I have a question.
Yeah.
I think it's kind of bouncing off a few of the things that have already been said.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm just wondering how much diversity there can be between people, like as workers. Like, how much can the system absorb that the differences between people, like especially with like mental health issues and things like that? Like, is that a concern?
Yeah, I mean, it is. In a way, it's sort of I think that that's a really important. This seems to be a very important point, and it seems to be it kind of re-implicates a sort of a distinction or an observation that I was sort of trying to offer earlier, which is that I tend to think of an ideal end state as one of pure self-employment, by which I mean every individual. No individual would be dependent on anybody else in order to be able to live a decent life, all right? And that means wouldn't have to depend on others to buy stuff that he or she wanted to sell, and wouldn't have to depend on others to hire him or her or let him or her into their club, so to speak, or into their co-op in order to, produce things or to sort of add value or to produce the means of sustenance and a decent life. That would be an ideal end state. And I suspect we can get a lot closer to that than most people are willing to admit. But if we stipulate for the moment that we're not going to get to that actual ideal, assuming it's an intelligible ideal within our lifetimes, and so it's really a question of, second best, third best, and so forth, then probably what we're talking about is a situation where basically the more people you have to combine with in order to produce the means of sustenance or the means of living a life, the greater the degree of separation from that ideal end state, right? So if you, again, to go back to the business partnership example, if you and I form a business partnership, there's a sense in which we're still sort of self-employed, but we're kind of jointly and severally self-employed rather than just, severally self-employed. That basically each of us is employed by us. And then if we expand it out to 3 or 4 or 10 people and we form a partnership, each of us is employed by the 10 of us as a 10-person, first person plural, as a 10-person we. And basically the more people you include in the cooperative or in the organization, the greater the degree of attenuation, at least potentially, between sort of the state that you're living in on the one hand and that kind of ideal of self-employment on the other. What that means, I think, in turn, then, is that we're always, anything short of that, the realization of pure self-employment is probably a situation in which there's some kind of compromising that's happening, right? That something is given up, right? That I guess it's sort of a gentler version of Jean-Paul Sartre saying, hell is other people, right? That, there's some degree, and so the question that raises then is how eccentric can one of us be, either, maybe through no fault, quote unquote, of their own. How eccentric can one of us be and still have a right to combine with others to, work jointly to produce the means of a decent life? And at what point is somebody so eccentric or so marginal that we basically just have to say, well, the best we can do for you is to give you something kind of like self-employment, but not the superior wealth generating capacity that might come through the synergistic effects of your working with others if they're not willing to work with you. And I just don't know if there's a single kind of overall, kind of all-encompassing answer to that form of dilemma. It might be a little bit like Stefan's. In this respect, I think the concern that you raised might have a certain resemblance to one that Stefan raised. By which I mean that it could well be that it's the particular difficulty might require its own means of address. I don't know if I can cook up a kind of a general articulation of how to deal with that general category of difficulty, right? It's going to be, the degree to which a difficulty like that comes up, of course, is going to be highly contingent, right? If we were all more or less identical, as the entire human population, let's say, was more or less identical as far as tastes go and quirks and habits and preferences, ways of thinking, so forth, then presumably we could all work together in whatever number and be a harmonious whole, right? Presumably there would be no significant difference between the degree of harmony with which 2 people work on the one hand and with which 10 or 15 or 20 people work together on the other. There might be sort of a similar degree of smoothness. I'm assuming that the more variation there is, the more likelihood difficulties in working together are going to emerge, and the greater the degree of those the greater the magnitude of those difficulties will be in connection with the greater the number of people who are, part of whatever organization is doing the working. And at that point, we have to come up with means of dealing with, conflict or disagreement or friction or what have you. And I just don't know if there's like an overall set of principles that I can articulate for sort of how to deal with those frictions. To make this a little bit more concrete, I've certainly known some people who are so abrasive and so seemingly unjustifiably abrasive that it's hard for me to imagine any group of people who would be willing to work with them in a cooperative enterprise. And so then the question becomes then, all right, well, what rights do you as the abrasive person have to access to various working groups? Is your right only to, some kind of a basic minimum that is your right whether you're working with others or not? Or do you have a right to work with others under certain circumstances, notwithstanding the fact that you have a degree of seemingly unjustifiable abrasiveness that other people just can't work with? And I just don't know how to answer a question like that in anything other than a kind of case-by-case way, And I don't know if that's owing to a deficiency of our capacities to sort of foresee and provide for various possibilities, or if it's somehow just inherent in the justice of the case. I just don't know. It's a tough one, I guess I would say.
So maybe we should ask Stephanie to close the conversation. Do you have your follow-up? Would you like to ask a follow-up, Stephanie?
Well, I guess I was going to be the sociologist in the room, in the virtual. And there's a sociological way of thinking about the person, which is the polar opposite of the way that you're describing a person, right? I don't, there's a sociological way of thinking about people as being fundamentally sort of relationally constituted interpersonal creatures, and not as sort of, people who are born with certain eccentricities and quirks, who are just more or less able to cooperate, but rather that kind of capacity is actually an effect of a whole set of socialization processes, which one could argue right now are the kind of institutions and socialization processes that actually do facilitate that capacity are in dire state, right?
Yeah.
When you have families that can't afford to pay rent or who are constantly overstressed, when you have younger generations who can't establish a family in the first place or are deeply in debt, there's all kinds of things that are making people on the one hand that are in my sense is sort of depriving them of this cooperative capacity that you would need to have in order for people to not be eccentric in the way that you're describing.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, is making them deeply interdependent, in all kinds of practical ways, just as like, in order to survive, essentially. People who are, there's a return to multifamily housing. There's, there are things that are sort of indicated, sort of like, I can't think of anybody. I guess what I'm saying is I can't think of anyone who is sort of the deeply independent, self-determined person that seems to be your sort of ideal person, and so I guess what happens to your sort of model or how you're thinking if you don't assume that this is that your default person is this sort of highly independent, highly capacious, highly cooperative kind of person, but in fact you assume that people are deeply interdependent, that people have children and grandparents, and and that people sort of operate in these relational worlds instead of being these self-determined individuals. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. I actually think, believe it or not, I'm more. I think I'm more in your camp on this than I might have seemed to be. I mean, again, the paper or the article is sort of, there's a lot that is just sort of taking for granted because of the sort of the intended audience or the, so I'm thinking about, basically Orthodox American political attitudes and beliefs, and to some extent Orthodox American economic attitudes and beliefs, which do tend to treat the individual as a kind of a black box. It's sort of classical liberal conception of the self, where the sort of unsituated self, it just is this kind of autonomous chooser, and we don't want to impinge on that autonomy without justification, and blah, blah, blah. I think that it's a kind of a bullshit conception of the human being. I completely agree with that, and I don't accept that particular conception of the human being, either as a matter of high theory or as a matter of just practical reality. But in a way, the article itself, the piece itself kind of ignores all of that or abstracts from it just because the assumption is, challenges an economic policy journal that economic policy people read. What I agree with is that, the sort of the sociological or even anthropological, sociological, cultural determinants of the person or of the self are much more important, much more critical in determining what each of us is than most of our social institutions actually in liberal, so-called liberal democracies seem to understand or seem to realize, right? Or what seems to, the reality of things seems to be way out of sync with the presumed background conditions on the basis of which many of our institutions have been constructed. And for that very reason, it seems to me that if we're really thinking in terms of, starting from square one when it comes to sort of developing a social order that doesn't accept anything that's currently out there, or doesn't take anything that's out there right now for granted, and then simply try to optimize it without questioning its basic presuppositions. If instead we're starting from scratch and asking ourselves, how should we construct a world or a society, I think we would want, at least I would want to do it a lot differently. And I would probably want to do it at the very least a little bit more closely to what they describe Japanese society as being built on, right? Where kids are not sort of segregated by age, where older kids are sort of supposed to look after younger kids. They're all in the same school. And this actually, I don't know if this is true. I don't know how generally true this is, but I've seen little reports here and there about, well, this is how they do education in Japan, or this is the way people think of themselves in Japan. They think of themselves as part of an organic whole and all that. I mean, I find that much more congenial, partly because it just seems to me ethically more attractive, but also partly because it just seems to be more in sync with the reality of things. And so given all that, I think I'm with you, and I would not actually find this paper of mine particularly interesting, from that point of view. I mean, if I were thinking in terms of starting from scratch. So I guess it's kind of a long-winded way of saying again that, the paper is sort of, in one way, it's a bullshit paper because it's trying to appeal to participants in a bullshit profession who who all sort of accept a bunch of bullshit presuppositions that most so-called Western polities and societies themselves seem to be kind of built on in a way. And boy, I'd love to change all of that. I can't, being sort of metabolically optimistic as I am, I can't help but think that at some point we're going to get there, provided that, we don't blow everything up first. But it's sort of, your question is wonderful because it's yet another salutary reminder of just how little is accomplished even by doing what this paper suggests be done. Even if we were able to do it, even if we were to do it, it's a suggestion. I feel like isn't it at the end of the Tractatus, or is it at the end of the somewhere Wittgenstein? I think maybe it's in the notebooks. At the end of the Tractatus says, what the greatest, the most important thing about this book is, once we've settled philosophy once and for all and said that and realized that it's just not even possible, we see how little we've accomplished. And I feel like saying a kind of a counterpart thing about an economic proposal of this sort. It's really only dealing with one tiny little problem, and without overturning various basic presuppositions on which everything seems to be based. I hope that's at least not too much of a dodge. So.
No, it's not. It's great. I mean, I understand. I think I understand something about your audience. I mean, sociologists are like the cranky little brother. That's always trying to get the bigger brother to listen.
And I didn't want to be overbroad. I was sort of being half flip when I said it's a sort of a bullshit profession or a bullshit discipline in talking about economists. I mean, obviously there's some really, really wonderful economists, but it does seem like the orthodoxy is certainly a bullshit orthodoxy, and political liberalism in its non-romantic variants also strikes me as being in many ways a kind of a bullshit political orientation. But even once one agrees with the next question, I guess, becomes, all right, so what do we do now? Whenever I find myself confronting that one, there are times I just sort of think, really, I just want to go out and live in Siberia, and live in, I don't know, I want to start some kind of an ideal community somewhere and just try to live out life in this ideal community. But, just don't seem to have quite the will to do. I don't have quite the willpower to go quite that far. It's been a fantasy since undergraduate years just to sort of pack it all in and become a shepherd in New Zealand. Maybe I'll still do that. But I typically think that way when I'm thinking, what am I doing? I basically ask myself your question. And when I realize that I don't really have a good answer to your question, and then that makes me sort of think, well, basically everything I'm doing is I'm doing on the basis of this sort of an edifice that really isn't a sustainable edifice. And I can't think of what to replace it with exactly, or at least how to do it. And so then I kind of want to throw my hands in the air and just go and live with the sheep,
Well, on that note, so one thing I'd like to say is I feel like I've learned a lot from this and tremendously enjoyed this interaction. But this is the point where I really look forward to the dinner conversation. Because I feel like we're well teed up for that now. So maybe we'll have another opportunity to do something like that.
I clap to that too. Let's do that. And again, by the way, I wanted to do this earlier, but apologies to everybody for not having been able to make it in person. This bloody knee thing has been a real problem. But I can't tell you how grateful I am that you were willing to kind of offer me the consolation prize of a kind of a virtual follow-up meeting. Thanks so much.
Our pleasure. We should thank our speaker. I don't know how well this will work over maybe the hands. So this has been recorded. We'll put it on the internet, and I don't know how far this will go, but I'm going to try to bring people into this space with their little 90-minute contributions, just various folks who are working in this area. So I'll send emails and such and join in as you'd like. Thanks again to everyone for joining, and I think that concludes our session.
Great. Thanks so much, guys. Up a million.
Thanks. Nice to meet you. Bye.